All right, everyone. It is the witching hour here at 1:30. We're going to get going. Try to be respectful as we can of everyone's time. We will try to stop right at 2:30 to make sure that we end right at our hour time slot. So we're going to spend the first, I don't know, 20, 30 minutes or so, maybe not that long, going through a quick presentation about Mexico and the cross-border trade. And then we're going to spend the rest of the time answering questions. I know a lot of you sent questions in when you registered, and we have those. But if you still need to answer, or sorry, if you still need to ask a few more questions, please feel free to do so. We have the Q&A section available, and we will mark the ones that we answer, and anything that we don't get answered live, we will make sure that we answer before we get it sent out. So with that, thank you guys again for coming. This is our Mexico webinar, and this is brought to you by Scarborough University. Scarborough University is our training arm for Scarborough International. We have a group of 5 companies that participates as part of Scarborough, and I myself am Adam Hill. I'm the Vice President of Operations for Scarborough. With us today is Rita Gonzales. Rita is our Mexican operations manager. So Rita sits in Scarborough's office in Laredo and Nuevo Laredo, Mexico, and she is responsible for all of the cross-border trade that happens between those 2 offices. So she is going to be the one giving most of the presentation today. I'll be here to help answer questions and make sure we try to keep us as close to we can as on time. Our contact information is available as well. Feel free to reach out to us if you need to for any questions or any comments about the webinar. You will also, once this is done, be getting a copy of the webinar recording. You'll be able to see it on our YouTube channel in its entirety, as well as each one of the questions that have been asked and answered. Those will also be in snippets on the YouTube channel as well. So with that, I am going to turn this over to Rita and let her get going, because that's who you are all here to listen to today.
Good afternoon. Thank you for logging in. We have here the first, in your screen, you might see that we have all the ports that Mexico have, and the ones in orange, the ones with, you have the border with the U.S. We would like to talk more about what is going on between the U.S. and Mexico for this presentation. We can go to another screen. Okay. Northbound. How the border crossing happens on northbound. These are shipments coming from Mexico into the U.S. As you can see in a very brief way that once the merchandise arrives to the border, we should have all the paperwork ready to cross them. This is the most not time consuming to do it on time of border crossing. Can you hear me? I hear a little bit of echo, sorry.
Yeah, we have you loud and clear.
Okay, sorry for that. I hear that. So if you can see, prior to, once the merchandise is shipped from Mexico, the first thing that, as the brokers, we receive is the Mexican shippers documentation that you can see. It's the normal commercial invoice, packing list, all other government agencies documents, and NAFTA certificate if it's required. At the same time, we prepare the customs entry on the U.S. So this is happening simultaneous between Mexico and the U.S. are both offices. Then once the truck or the merchandise arrives to the border, we should have a designated carrier to cross from Mexico into the U.S. Even though it's a very short distance, well, that's where the time is consumed. You know, we can have an average to 4 all the way to 7 hours for border crossing because of the lines and the detail that both authorities will like to check on the merchandise. We will discuss later on what we do on the paperwork, just to keep on going. Like I said, we prepare, or we hired a drayage, a local truck. Usually there are Mexican trucks. They are the ones who sit for those hours at the border to do the border crossing. Not the trucks from Mexico or the trucks from the U.S., the carriers are usually, very few are the ones who do actually the border crossing. We have service providers, local service providers, that are the ones doing this actual border crossing. Once it crosses from Mexico into the U.S., we deliver it to the terminal. It can be our own, the broker's warehouse, or it can be, if we know who's the carrier who's going to haul it up north, then we can deliver directly to them. And then, later on, the delivery happens. So this is coming from Mexico into the U.S. And, like I said, the time consuming is the border crossing. Now let's talk a little bit about southbound. This is going from the U.S. into Mexico. The same happens at the same time that the merchandise leaves the supplier, the exporter in the U.S. Paperwork has to be sent to the broker, to the client, to the importer in Mexico, and we will receive the merchandise here at the border. Why the merchandise stops at the border and it gets unloaded and delivered to the Mexican brokers' warehouses or to the freight forwarders' warehouse is because the Mexican broker needs to verify what is that the shipper is sending to the Mexican importer. This means they have to do a count. They have to count each piece. They need to check for special markings. They need to verify that country of origin, the markings of the merchandise, and that whatever is going to be on Mexican customs documents, it's accurate according to what physically we receive at the warehouses. Here it's time consuming also. That's why it doesn't go directly into customs until this is verified. Also, here is where we file the AES, the EEI, the export, electronic export information to the Census and U.S. Customs prior to the border crossing. For trucking, we have to have that filed at least 1 hour ahead of time that we present the merchandise with U.S. Customs for exportation purposes. U.S. Customs very rarely stops a truck to check what is being declared, but just in case, we also have to be very, fines are, Adam can say about that, fines are very significant in case we avoid not filing the EI or we don't declare the correct amount of merchandise. Okay, prior to the border crossing, once we prepare our Mexican pedimento, that's our customs document to enter into Mexico, Mexico requires that all duties and taxes has to be paid prior to the border crossing. So that's another step that as brokers we have to wait for the importer to send us their funds for us to pay on their behalf to the to customs all the duties due prior to the border crossing. And also there's a step there that we transmit a COVE, C-O-V-E, that it's the documents, is the invoice of the shipper. We have to declare it electronically. But we will see that in the next screen for you. Once we check our merchandise, we prepare our documentations for customs purposes, we pay duties and taxes. Again, we hired a local drayage to do the border crossing. They will come and hook the trailer, and we load them, and they go to U.S. Customs Police first, and then they go to Mexican Customs, a less than a half-mile distance, but they have to stop for both customs. Once we get to Mexican Customs, well, we can have a red light or a green light. That's mean if the cargo is chosen for intensive, or is going to be have a green light, then it can go without any more detention time at the border. Yeah, we cannot say it's random, the selection, unless, sometimes Mexican wants to inspect a special commodity, so everybody will stop and be inspected. Once we exit Mexican Customs, we go to the terminal, Mexican terminal, and deliver our merchandise. And from there, the Mexican carriers will take it to final destination. That's in a brief steps what goes on in the process to send merchandise from the U.S. into Mexico. Okay, I think so. You have heard probably from your customers or your shippers that now Mexico, since 2012, in June 2012, Mexico made it mandatory that everybody have to replace paper with digital information. And they have a single window that we know it as VUCEM because of the initials in Spanish for the single window for the international trade in Mexico. On this, when you log into this application in Mexico that belongs to the IRS in Mexico, here as the importer, as an exporter, or as a broker, we can log in to all the other government agencies that Mexico has and comply with all their non-tariff regulations, get permits, transmit the information of the invoice, send e-documents, electronic documents such as NAFTA certificates, packing list. So this is just one site that everybody logs in to comply with the paperless and transmit digital information. Most of the files go in the XML form that it can be read later on. Well, this portal is for the trade community, exclusively for submitting information and also for paying any permit or any inspection that you have to do prior to your border crossing. Obviously, this tool helps the government to have a better control of what's going on in the trade, and also has more visibility in all the documents and all the permits, and gather better statistics on what's going on. So with that, and we would like to go and see the requirements that we do, what we do briefly in VUCEM. One of the things that we do prior, at the same time that we're inspecting the merchandise, is transmitting the commercial invoice, the shipper's invoice, or northbound or southbound. This goes for both shipments. Here, we have to transmit in an electronic way all the information that your supplier or the shipper provides in their invoice. It has to be obviously date, reference invoice, all the line by line of the invoice. We have to declare the part numbers, serial numbers. If you have books, the ISBN, anything that identifies the merchandise, we transmit it in this document with unit prices and origins, The certificate of origin also is being transmitted through this website. Also, permits, license, certifications, all the letters that we require to the importers to declare, everything through this website of the VUCEM is being transmitted. As brokers, we have programs that we don't have to log in individually on the website, but we communicate and transmit to them through our systems that gather all the information. For Mexican exportation, as going a little note for northbounds, if you are bringing merchandise from Mexico, in 2014, Mexico said, you know what, everybody in Mexico that is making a sale, it's required to, making a final sale is required to transmit their invoices in an electronic manner. And we call it the CFDI, Digital Internet Tax Receipt. Also, the shipper in Mexico will have to transmit with all the requirements an invoice has to transmit electronically, and that way the IRS in Mexico is notified that, okay, you made this sale and you're expecting to get paid, or you're already being paid because you already transmit an income receipt, like we call it, an invoice. And if you see in the bottom of the screen, you should have each seller, each vendor have their own reference, their consecutive number that is an internal control. Now in Mexico, that number is given another string of numbers and letters to identify that transmission. So we don't declare any more invoices numbers or internal numbers that are only for purposes of the companies who issue it. Now the government assigns a very particular number to each commercial invoice. So that was in 2014. Everybody in Mexico who makes a sale, doesn't matter if it's going to be for trade purposes, for export or purposes, or just domestic, had to do that. But in July 2016, the government, the Mexican government says now all these tax receipts with that long string of numbers that is being provided by them, by the SAT, by the IRS, now you have to submit it and declare it on your export pedimento, on your export customs declaration. So something that was internal, now it became an obligation also for the exporters in Mexico to transmit. In other words, the government wants to know if you do a final sale, if this is going to go for consumption to another country, we would like to have it recorded in our IRS systems, even though the sale hasn't occurred yet. But the exporters are giving this information to the IRS, and the brokers, we are transmitting that code so it can match the customs entry with the invoice. So that was new in 2016. By now, most of the exporters are getting used to provide that information. The only exception is when you're sending temporarily items that are not for sale, so you are not obligated on this one. Okay, if we go very briefly, the commercial invoice, obviously we need to have in Mexico a place and date, an invoice number. Even though it's an internal number, it's very important to assign an ID number so that way we can refer to that document. Imagine if we had to look with, you know, your invoice number for 30 digits that the IRS assigned to this document, it will be a little bit more difficult, the communication. So we still recommend to provide an invoice number, even though it's just for internal purposes. Has to have a consignee name and an address if it's different from the importer in the US, or it has to have a product ID so we can, so it can be sent into the COBE, into the VUCEM, the single window. If the product don't have an ID, we have to more or less give it a consecutive number just for to identify it, because it's obligated to send it to the through the COBE to the electronic invoice. Quantity, unit value, and also the unit that is being sold. If it's a package or if it is a piece by pound, by yard, it has to say how are you selling this merchandise or how you are buying it, depending northbound or southbound. This is very important because we are obligated to declare the unit that it's handled on the World Organization units, or we call it OMA. It's a standard for all the world. So we have like 1,000 sales units. So we have to declare the one that the supplier is providing. You know, it can be pails, drums. We have to declare a specific ID for that unit. Also, all invoices have to have the total, has to be totalized and give us the currency. It can be in US dollars, Canadian dollars, whatever is the currency, it has to be on the invoice. And all the information of the sellers, the seller name and the address. We have been asked very frequent if the seller is obligated to put in their invoice, their tax ID. Let's say you are sending merchandise into Mexico. It's not required, but it's you have to provide it to your customer or to the Mexican broker because it has to be linked. It cannot, not necessarily have to be printed on the invoice, but it does have to be provided. Okay. Very Mexican customs regulations. We would like to go brief also and just touch the most recent changes that is going on. Mexican customs in January and late December, we were supposed to comply with Article 81 of Mexican customs law, and it's been postponed for I think so now for June. This is something that is going on for 2 years and somehow is not being can't find a way how to comply with it. This is why Mexican customs wants for all the importers to provide to the Mexican broker, besides their commercial invoice, the bill lading, the packing list, certificate of origins, any warranties if your merchandise is benchmark, is undervalued, proof of payment to your supplier, all your bills that your freight forwarding, transportation, and insurance companies are going to bill you for their service of moving this merchandise, and buyer and seller contracts. If you have terms, let's say 30 days to pay, well, you have to have proof that, okay, I'm not paying this, that's why I cannot provide you a wire transfer of the goods that I'm importing it because I have a 30 days credit. And also all the other bills, if you're billed because creating your merchandise for handling fees at other ports, if it's coming through ocean port. As you can see, all this information, if we need to have it prior the importation of the goods, it's going to hold longer at the border until we recover all this paperwork and all these bills and all this proof of payment. So we have 2 years that is being postponed. Now the latest news is for June. the importers are fighting this, and also the brokers, because we don't need to have all your personal agreements with your buyers and sellers, and also not everybody invoices prior to the border crossing. You know, your freight company doesn't invoice you prior the goods arrive, and you want to cross it today. We are not going to have the bill for your transportation. Or your insurance company, you do quarterly reports, we're not going to have the bill. So all this is getting still discussed and how we're going to handle, but I wanted to have for you to have that in your mind in case after June you start hearing that they need, the importers in Mexico are requiring all these bills so they can prove customs where they're paying. The reason is because all bills or expenses prior to border crossing, everything that is due at the border have to be added to the value of the merchandise. And this will add the customs value, which is the base for tax purposes, for duties and tax purposes in customs. So this is why it's very important for the Mexican government that to have the right amount that you are paying being added to the value of the merchandise, and also this will and pay the right bill, the right duties based on the value of the merchandise by bills.
Hey, Rita, do you think that, you know, this has been postponed twice already, and
Yes.
you know, it's been 2 years now, and now they're telling us June. I mean, what does your gut say? Do you think they're going to be able to get this, this last piece about proof of payment, the insurance bills, you know, the freight bills? Do you think they're actually going to be able to do this, or do you think this is something that's going to drag out for a long time?
I think so. They're gonna be more flexible. What we've been hearing on with the National Association of Brokers is that they're gonna be more flexible. Let's say let's allow us to have the quote of your transportation bill, you know, so you can declare it. Or if you have terms of credit, just give us a letter, you know, an affidavit that you swear that with this supplier you have terms of 30 days, and don't send to the broker the proof of payment.
Right.
They're already allowing that, but afterwards they're saying, okay, but you still have to send it to the broker, and the brokers are like, we don't need that information. That's not our purposes. You know, we cannot be auditing our own customers in their own accounting, in their own deals. And also, just to say something, I don't see Coca-Cola providing any agreements or forward agreements with their suppliers to the brokers, no? So
no, I totally agree with you. I was just curious what you had been hearing and thinking down there as well.
yeah, but well, we're hoping that it gets postponed on June to December.
Yes, I agree.
Yes, let's see how that goes. We'll keep everybody informed if there's any changes on that. Okay, but just keep in mind.
So we have a lot of questions coming in, and I don't know if we want to maybe start to answer some of those and see if we can get to some of these last pieces, because I know there's a lot of people asking a lot of questions. I'm going to go back up here to this first one. Here's a question: is I have a Mexican customer, so that's a southbound cargo, that insists we add a value for the packaging, even though the shipper isn't charging them for the packaging. Do they really need to add that value? What it is basically what it seems like is maybe tools being shipped in a plastic toolbox, because that's the safest way to ship the product. So do they need to add the value? What it sounds like the brokers, the customers asking for is for them to add the value of the toolbox. Is that necessary?
Well, it's not necessary, but I can see where the importer in Mexico is doing this. On the pediment to the Mexican customs entry, we have to declare gross weight. Okay, like, you know, this is my gross weight, and then we have the net weight of your merchandise. The difference has to be the packaging material. And for accounting purposes, you have to enter separately if that packaging material, you can reuse it. So what they're doing is, since they are importing it, at this point, they are fixing that. We're gonna have the value of my packaging material that I can put in my accounting. If it's wooden, let's say if it's pallets, wooden pallets that can be reused, it has to enter as a commodity in the Mexican accounting. And it has to be withdrawn if you use it to ship something else, you know. It's not obligated, but I see where that importer is, why he's asking it for.
Okay, so it sounds like, so if they were to say, if their product weighs 10 kilos and the toolbox weighs 1 kilo, would it be better if they just put on there it's 11 kilos total and not worried about the packaging then?
Well, is this actually the commodity toolbox, or that was just an example?
No, that was just an
okay, the toolbox, they need to declare it separately. Yes, that will be. But if it's just a
plastic box that they ship their product in.
A plastic box.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it has to be declared separately. Yeah, okay. And in that case, because it's something that can be reused later on, and if it's those pallets that are made of plastic, or those crates made of plastic, they do want them to give them a value and get it as an inventory. Doesn't matter if it's a $1, you know,
okay,
that it has to do. Yes.
Well, I'm going to go back. I'm going to ask you another question here, but it's really tied to this southbound one. And I think this question, which you and I have talked about a lot in the past couple of years, is the speed that all of this happens, right? Cargo gets to our facility in Laredo, and then it seems like it just stops. And I think people, you know, is it paperwork? Is it product? Which piece really starts to slow this down? You know, from my experience in talking to a lot of people, you know, it's, you know, maybe there's something that identifies that product, like serial numbers that they don't provide us, or what are some of the other things that maybe people could do to help speed up that process, so we have to do less work on our side in order to validate what's been sent?
If their invoice has a lot of part numbers, and that part number, you can identify it in the product, you know, it's been labeled somehow with that part number, I will always say, please help the broker get all this information, input all this information, provide it in an Excel sheet, you know, because that you can upload it in your systems, and all the input of the information line by line of your invoice will go faster. If your product has serial numbers, please also provide a list of the serial numbers. If the product, like books, it's an ISBN number, please provide that also, because it has to go on a digital, have to be declared in a digital manner to customs. So that's why sometimes the merchandise gets here and it gets stuck, because the broker, it's unwrapping everything and it's checking according to their packing list, that if you say you are sending 100 of this item, I have 100. Also, 50% of the tariff requires weight, and we don't get the weights. We have to go and get each piece and weight each piece. You know, it can be a big piece or it can be a very small piece. Needles, you need needles for your circle knitting machines. We need to weigh those needles. So if the shipper provides their invoice with, and separately can provide all their serial numbers or the ID numbers, the origin of the goods, and with all their documents, it will help to expedite. But then we have something we haven't talked about it. It's all the norms, the labeling, the markings that has to be in compliance prior border crossing. And Mexico does regulate us exactly how it has to be labeled, each item, each product, if it's going to go to be sold to the final consumer in Mexico, that is not going to be resale for resale purposes. So that's what is holding. It is the verification of the products. Why? Because the broker is liable, holds liability on what they are declaring. So he's going to be make sure that if you're telling me this, what it's made of, if I don't have that information, I need to classify each item. And after I classify that item, I need to see what regulation, non-tariff regulation they have. It could be not only labeling, it could be that you have to have an exception saying, okay, this is not above this pressure per inch, square inches, or whatever measurement it is. You have to start asking for affidavits from the importer. You have to check that it's not wood. You don't have wood, because if you have wood, then you have to go and inspect your, go to USDA, Zagarpa, Mexico equivalent, and get your items inspected. You know, like our customers of lamps, they just tell me just the base has wood. Well, guess what? I do, just for that base of wood, I need to go and have it inspected, and now I need for you to tell me what kind of wood it is, the scientific and the generic number. So as more information you provide to the broker, that will expedite the border crossing. And like we always have said, Adam, we need, prior to the border crossing, if you contact your importer and the importer, the broker, to see all the requirements the items are going to need to be in compliance with, it will be fabulous. Like if you label it, but you label it country of origin, made on USA, you put the initials USA, we had that case. Everything has to be relabeled because Mexico says, no, you have to say EUA. You know, something so simple like that, but stop the merchandise at the border to upgrade, you know, to revise all the labels and put the right initials of the country of origin.
Well, I think you brought up an interesting point too, because, you know, you talk about we get a packing list and it might say there's 1,000 pieces in there, but when we get it to our facility there, we might have, you know, we are obviously going to go through and look, and there's only 990 pieces in there because they're short 10. How should the shipper, how should the customer, how does that problem get dealt with? Because that's obviously very common. You know, you think that you're shipping this many pieces, you know, did the common carrier that you ship down there lose 10? Is a box missing? Did we miscount? Did the shipper miscount? How do people kind of deal with that?
Well, like let's say 1,000 pieces at our warehouse. Well, you're not going to count each one. You're going to open randomly boxes, let's say, okay, and if it's labeled outside, each box has 50 items, we're going to count. Okay, open another one so we can say, okay, we can trust what the supplier told us. You know, it's 50 pieces. Okay, we're going to check that it has no special markings. Perfect. It can go. But guess what? We found 40. It's very common to find something that is missing because for some reason the boxes they pull out, especially in the pick and packs process. They pull out pieces to complete an order, and we get that. Mexico allows you to say, okay, I have an invoice for 1,000, but I'm going to declare 990. We call it subdivision. Yes, of the invoice, and the importer only declares 990 and pays duties and taxes for those 990. I mean, that's
So what it sounds like to me is that And I think this is where the question, it ultimately comes down to that Mexican broker that's there in the warehouse counting on what that actual piece count is going to be. So, you know, if there's a discrepancy, you know, because it does happen, the shipper says, I shipped 1,000, and the importer says, I only got 990, you know, that person there in the middle, which in a lot of cases is Scarborough ourselves, at the office you're sitting in right now, you know, we're the ones that kind of have that almost final say. It says, no, there's really only this many pieces here.
Yes, I mean, well, we take pictures and we show them the label. Sometimes we look for boxes that are have been opened before,
Right.
you know, and not have. So we say something probably can be missed. Years of experience, or they have an X, or probably they withdraw, you know, and all the products like shampoos, conditioners, and all that, it happens. But if we miss it, because you cannot sometimes open all the boxes and count it, and if we miss it, well, you declare more. There's you pay duties and taxes for 10 items that are not there. Well, customs is not gonna fine you. But let's go the other way.
Right.
We have very common that if you purchase 100, I'm gonna give you 10 items free, and you're not gonna pay for them, so I'm not gonna invoice them. And we find those extra 10 items. That's where we get in. That's where the importer gets in trouble and the broker.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a solution. You don't need to change your invoice. You don't need to invoice it. Just if the importer and the vendor in the U.S. acknowledge, yes, I send you 10 extra items, well, we're going to declare those extra 10 items with a different mode of value. Instead of saying I have an invoice commercial value, I'm going to say I'm giving it the exact value of the ones that I have right now in my warehouse that are 100. Each one is $1. I'm going to declare this $1. Let's say it's a conditioner. Instead of for volume, it's for freeze hair. Well, we have a same ounces. We declare a value, the same dollar, but we say we're doing it based on a similar product. So you don't need to change. That's what a lot of vendors don't know. You don't need to change your invoice, but just on the packing list, add it.
Mm-hmm.
And customs is going to get their duties and their taxes, because, well, for customs, there's nothing for free, you know.
Right.
You have to always provide a value for those surplus, that we call it the surplus items.
So you brought up two things that I want to touch on real quick. First is you talked about, you know, packaging that could be reused, like a plastic box or a plastic pallet that's reusable. What if it's a wooden pallet? What's the difference there? Is there anything special? Does it have to get inspected? Is heat treatment required? Is there anything special if it's just moving on a wooden pallet?
Well, if any crates, you know, that just build up especially for the size of your machinery or whatever you're protecting, and wooden pallets, everything that is wood, even though it's a little piece that you just want it to, so that it won't move, the piece don't move when it's being shipped, it has to be properly marked, not with the ISPM 15. If you know, that's all over all the countries who participate in this program. Everybody says, okay, here locally we call it that it's the wheat, like it looks like a wheat, and it has the country that fumigate or gave it the heat treated treatment, or it has also the number of the authorized supplier, and if it's not properly marked for that purposes to be exported, then what we do here, Scarborough does, is, well, we help our customers and we transload the merchandise to mark wooden pallets. Obviously, that costs more to the importer, because now he has to pay maneuvers in wooden pallets. that are marked. But please, we see a lot that it only has the marking, the stamp of the HT heat treated. You know, and originally the wood was treated. It's not valid. Not even going northbound or southbound. U.S. Customs is also very, well, you know, very strict on that.
Right.
And it's very important for everybody to know both U.S. Customs, if you're bringing a shipment and your supplier doesn't, in Mexico doesn't put it on wooden pallets that are properly marked, and if it gets an intensive in U.S. Customs at a northbound shipment, Customs will not allow it to come into the U.S. and it has to go back into Mexico. Mexico was not going to allow it to go into Mexico, so we end up in a vicious circle, and we have to go to a very tedious process with Mexican USDA to allow us to fumigate the merchandise outside the premises of Customs. And if there's merchandise that needs to be, you know, that is for food or animal or cannot be fumigated with the only chemical that is available, then you run into more problems. So I'm glad you say that, because fines are very high on that if it doesn't come with properly marked.
Right, and the other piece that you kind of hit on is the big difference between U.S. customs brokers and Mexican customs brokers, where in the United States, you know, the importer is the one that's ultimately responsible, and the biggest difference is in Mexico, it's that Mexican customs broker who's responsible. And I think that's the big difference, and that's why all of these things happen prior to product actually crossing the border, because it's not like here in the U.S. where there's the corporate veil, and there is the importer is the one who's responsible to know what's coming in into the country and provide proper information to the broker. It is down to the Mexican customs broker to decipher whether or not what the importer gave them is right or wrong, and if it was wrong, still turn in the right information to Mexican customs. And I think that's a big difference that people don't always understand, and that's why this process takes time, because it's a lot different. It's not just a paperwork flow, it's an actual physical goods flow where we're counting and inspecting, and we're counting and inspecting because the broker has 100% all of the liability, rather than here in the US where the importer is the one that takes on that liability. And so I just wanted to mention that as well, that, you know, that's obviously a difference that we have here between both countries.
Yes, in a way that Mexican law encourages is that it says if you don't comply, especially with the non-tariff regulations, the penalties usually are economical for the broker. They're going to fine not the importer at that moment, they're going to fine the broker at that moment. And
right.
Also there are some dangerous ones, like if you forgot to declare some merchandise and they consider that you're smuggling, and it should have, let's say it should have a permit from the Army, a permit, it's a textile item, then it has jail, you know, involved. So the broker we are very motivated to inspect our merchandise
yes.
here at the border.
For sure.
Yes.
So here's a question is, kind of switching gears a little bit, is our product has a 0% duty rate, and so they do not provide a NAFTA to the Mexican importer. However, the Mexican importer is still requesting a NAFTA certificate because their statement is they have to pay a penalty, which is a percentage of the value, if a NAFTA is not provided. One, is that a true statement? And two, what's that percent if that is a true statement?
If the product that is being exported from the U.S. into Mexico does not qualify for NAFTA.
No, in this case, the product would qualify, but it's duty-free, so they don't issue one.
Okay, their policy is not to issue one. Well, if it's duty-free, the Mexican importer will need to pay only what we know as MPF. Mm-hmm. The merchandise processing fee. That is a 0.8% of the merchandise, but there's no penalty for not declaring a NAFTA product being NAFTA.
But so in that same scenario, if they were to provide the NAFTA certificate, does the importer in Mexico still have to pay the MPF?
No, that's
so really what they're talking about is that 0.8%.
That 0.8% that it's well, it can be some saving money, and also that 0.8% is added to the value of the merchandise, and then as consequences also they have to pay VAT, you know, the 16% of sales tax in Mexico.
The EVA. So basically they take the value of the goods, they add your 0.8% in MPF, and then you pay your 16% EVA.
Yes, so it's a money saving. You know, if a NAFTA is provided, it saves money okay, for all, and that's only for NAFTA products. Now, there's no way if it's duty free and they don't, only MPF is involved there. So I can see the reason why they wanted to declare, as long as there's it does qualify for NAFTA.
Gotcha. No, that makes sense.
Probably, yeah. Or probably they are adding this product or this raw material into another product that later they're going to export. And if they don't have a NAFTA, well, at the time they export it, then they might have to pay. They might not qualify, you know, their item for final product for NAFTA too. You know,
right.
We should see what's going on there. Yes.
So, you know, so kind of taking a step here to, I'm going to go back down to this Article 81 slide that we were talking about with, you know, the proof of payment and things like that. If the Mexican government eventually does enforce this, is there going to be a separate form that needs to be filled out, or is it just going to be that the shipper needs to provide that information to the broker?
Well, it's not going to be a form. The government wants us to have in our file copy of the bills. You know, if you use a Scarborough, you know, Scarborough Transportation, Scarborough is the one moving the freight. Well, Scarborough has to bill, and whoever, let's say if the importer is buying export, and Scarborough Transportation is bringing the goods to the border, well, Scarborough Transportation needs to bill immediately the freight, so we can have the actual bill, the actual amount. Why this getting more postponed? Because let's say you estimated $100 of freight is a consolidated, but that's what you quote based on the information the shipper provide. But when you actually weighed it and got the dimensions of the bundles, you said, no, this should have been now 245. We already crossed the merchandise and we already declared $200. Now we have to go back and do an amendment to our customs entry and add those $45 that are going to increase the taxes and the duties that are already being paid.
Okay.
So that's what all the brokers are saying. We're just going to be doing amendments of entries, because as bills are going to come, but you know, it's going to take time. I don't know who bills at the same time the merchandise arrived at the border. You know.
Right.
You know. And that's the importers. That's going to be the importer's responsibility, the Mexican importer responsibility to gather its bills with their suppliers in the U.S. or their vendors in the U.S. So and Mexico cannot rule how long you can take to bill an importer in Mexico. So that's why probably this is, I don't know how this is going to go at the end, you know.
Right. So talking just a little bit more about value, in the United States for customs, we have something called the first sale rule, where you can use the value of the original sale to declare to customs to pay duties and things like that. Does Mexico have the same rule or no?
No, no. I know about the first rule in the U.S. that actually, well, you can buy as the first person's cost and the chain
Right.
of buyer. Well, no, because we have to import that in Mexico, that merchandise to the actual value that the Mexican is going to pay. Why? Because for that wire transfer to, be credited, it has to have to the foreign vendor, supplier, it has to have a pedimento, it has to have a customs entry matching. If the importer gets audited and says, okay, you pay $10,000 to XYZ Inc. in the U.S., but your pedimento, it's $9,000, the value of your merchandise, so there's a discrepancy there, so
Right.
everything has to match. I have never heard, to be honest, that they allowed to pay duties based on a lower value of the supply, the way it's being resold by all the chain of supply, so no, not to my knowledge, no.
We have another question come in. Is there a good place for specifically shippers to go to look for, what are the required markings? What are the required labelings? Is there a good spot for them to go? Or is that something that they just need to kind of work through their broker with? Or what's the best way for them to get some of that information?
I will say go through the broker. You can go to the Secretary of Economy, Minister of Economy. That's the agency, the government agency that rules all the non-tariff regulations, labelings or certifications, but you're just going to pull it out and try to read it and see, but it will help someone to interpret that norm, and won't tell you to which items it's required, So I would say go to the broker, because we have it backwards. We have the item and we have the tariff, and from there we can tell you everything that is going to be required on that product. I mean, it's not very friendly, let's say. It's very
right.
to read it and withdraw information, but
well, something that I think is also difficult is a lot of countries, other countries that we do business with the United States, provides this information in English. They provide translated copies. They provide things so it's easier to get product into their country. The Mexican government does not. They don't provide anything all the way down to just their basic customs tariff. You can't get a translated copy unless you have somebody actually translate it. So I think that's also a big difference for people to know, and that's why it is a little bit more difficult to ship there, is because a lot of that information that maybe you as a shipper would go gather on your own, you can't go gather on your own.
Yes, it's correct. You can click on the website English, but only the main headline.
Right.
But once you click OK requirements, it will be in Spanish, and like all laws will say, go see this first. We'll refer you to other regulations, and that's when it starts. I mean, not to be misinformed. That's what I'm saying. It's there, right, available, but I would recommend if it's a new product or something you're not familiar with, ask the importer to send it to the broker to see what's the requirements, or call Scarborough, and we'll gladly advise you on that.
Just a quick housekeeping note. We're almost out of time, but we still have a lot of questions, so we're actually going to let this run over some. We will send this out as part of a follow-up email with the entire presentation that you see here, along with the recording of the webinar. But we're going to keep going here for a few minutes, try to answer a few more questions. Does the commercial invoice, which is obviously the value of the materials crossing the border, also have to match the vendor invoice that is paid by the importer? I'm assuming we're talking southbound here. So, you know, in the U.S., it's, you know, U.S. Customs kind of calls it that three-way match of purchase order, commercial invoice, payment. Do you agree? Is Mexico the same way?
Yes, yes. And why, yeah, payment invoice and, you know, and the purchase order, and obviously in the middle, matching everybody, it's the customs entry, the pedimento.
Right.
Yes, it does have to include the price that actually is going to be paid.
Right, right.
Even
So,
also if you're charging for, let's say, technical support, or added to the invoice. You know, there's freight or material handling, everything that you can. We recommend it to add it to the invoice.
So we have someone else that, and we've already kind of covered this, but I at least want to say it out loud one more time. And they talk about how when product moves northbound, it moves much quicker than when it moves southbound. And I think that really has to come down to really two main points. One is all of that validation work that product goes through on the southbound side. And the reason I say that, and I think probably if we get even more political in our response, the answer is really it's duties. Product that's leaving Mexico, the government's not collecting any revenue on, but the product that's coming in, going southbound to Mexico, the government's collecting revenue on it. And I think you can tie this even back to the United States, whereas product that's leaving the country, while Customs is kind of cracking down on some of their compliance, they're much more concerned with the value and things of that nature on products coming in, because remember, governments, especially duty, like Customs in the United States, it's the second largest income producer behind the IRS. So, you know, there's a lot of money on the line for those governments, and I think that's why that process slows down so much.
Yeah, and northbounds have less non-tariff regulations, no duties, so it goes smoother. You just said it very precisely. That's the main reason. And don't forget, Mexican Customs, it's under the IRS. You know,
right.
The big boss is the IRS. Which
is actually where U.S. Customs was prior to 9/11. It reported through Department of the Treasury with its number one objective was to protect the revenue of the United States. And then after 9/11, you know, we move under the Department of Homeland Security in the U.S. Now its number one objective is to secure our borders. But prior to that event, you know, it was to protect the revenue of the United States. And I don't think people realize that customs and duties came out of generating revenue and generating money for governments.
Yes. Yes.
So we have a question here that I can answer here real quick, and it is, what are the best resources for finding a reliable customer, partner, distributor in Mexico? There are both private and public groups that help with this. We do a lot of work with the Mexican consulate. If you need a contact there, or you need a better way to get a hold of them, please reach out to us and we can get you directed in the right direction.
Yes.
So on the COVE, it says, COVE, can you speak to items for free of charge distribution in Mexico? I'm not following the question. I was hoping you might be able to follow.
Free of charge?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. How we do handle the merchandise that is free of charge?
Right. So I think kind of what they're talking about is, you know, maybe it's a charitable gift, maybe it's it's a donation, but it's actual physical product. It's not just money moving. They're sending something. Maybe they're sending books to a school. Maybe they're sending something to a hospital, or some kind of donation. How does the cove take into account that these items were provided free of charge because they were a donation? What kind of reporting happens there?
Okay, for donations, Mexico has a very short list of agencies, or let's say the Red Cross. It's one that is authorized to receive their donations, and obviously the government, the cities or the counties are authorized to receive donations, and it's a different chapter, and we treat it different. But if the consignee in Mexico is not in that list, we will treat that merchandise as if you were selling it into Mexico. Duties will apply, taxes will apply,
No different.
and all of the non-regulations will need to be, we will need to comply with it. The only thing that is not going to happen is that the consignee will not be paying back the shipper and
Right.
the shipper. But if that's why when we just went through some shipments like that, the first thing that it needs to be verified is, are you an authorized entity to receive in Mexico donations? If not, it has to be in compliance as a regular sales.
Right.
Yes.
All right, so we actually have three more questions, but they're all basically the same, and it's going to ask us to give more of our personal opinions, I guess, more so than anything. And it's, with the new administration, do you foresee? I obviously have some of my own thoughts, but what do you foresee as any big changes coming, or do you see very much the status quo? Are some of the Mexican importers and shippers, getting more excited about some things? Are they trying to ship more, ship less? I mean, so is there anything from south of the border that you can kind of add here for people to maybe understand a little bit more, or at least take a guess at maybe where this next administration is going?
Well, like all of us, we're waiting for the reunion, probably if it happens in the middle of this year, at the end of this year, where they're going to be discussing NAFTA. And for all of us that are at the border, well, it's very important to see what will be the outcome in their agreements. I've been in this business before NAFTA, so it's been a while. So I think so. In my personal opinion, is that we will keep working. We will keep working in agreement, all of us in the NAFTA. Changes probably will happen, and probably in some tariffs or some other requirements will be asked on both sides. But in my personal opinion, I don't think so that it's going to be closing the borders or everything. Obviously, if you're planning to buy land over here, or you're planning to build something, well, at least this year everybody will be waiting to see what's going to happen on the agreement. But there are so many important industries that work together in the three countries, the automotive and other industries, that I don't think so they're going to disappear as it is. Same happens when the maquiladora started in 1982, and now changes will happen, but I don't think so. Closing the border, too extreme. I'm very optimistic. So am
I.
I'm very optimistic. We are in this business, and trade it's not gonna end. I believe in that.
Yeah, no, I personally completely agree with you. I think that there may be some minor changes, or maybe some changes that affect a very small subset of the industries that do cross-border business. But for the most part, I do feel like we will remain very close to the status quo, and business will just continue to operate. With all of that, we did go over about 10 minutes. I apologize for going over. However, we did try to make sure we answered everyone's questions. So thank you all for joining. We appreciate it, and we look forward to seeing you on our next webinar. Thanks, guys. Thanks, Rita.
Thank you. Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Bye.